his 1796 farewell address that of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. This view enjoyed continued support in the 19th century, with the de Tocqueville writing that religion in America must be regarded as the first of their political institutions, for if it does not impart a taste for freedom, it facilitates the use of it. Indeed, religious liberty provided the foundation for our country's modern political order, respect for democracy and rule of law. Similarly, the ability to worship and exercise one's faith without fear of attack, censure, bribery, or government reprisal is one of the most important metrics of freedom in any country. Today, we meet to examine the state of religious freedom in the Western Hemisphere, home to Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim faiths, as well as a range of indigenous beliefs. In particular, as Latin America contains nearly half of the world's Catholics, and the first Latin American Pope is set to address Congress next week, I believe this hearing is timely in bringing public awareness to the importance of international religious freedom. While religious minorities in Latin America and the Caribbean do not experience the same level of persecution they face elsewhere in the world, i.e. ISIS in the Middle East, the state of religious freedom in our own hemisphere does deserve our attention. Unfortunately, this year has seen a noticeable uptick in violations of religious freedom in several countries in the region. While most governments have constitutions with clauses that protect religious freedom, the implementation of those protections are often not rigorously enforced, and in certain countries, other laws or regulations have been written that make religious worship and activities hard. For instance, in countries such as Bolivia, Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, it is government action itself that contributes directly to difficulties in religious practice. In other countries, such as Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, the combination of criminal groups, lawless environments, or impunity prevents the free exercise of religious worship and activities. In particular, this subcommittee has heard multiple reports of Catholic and Protestant churches being forced to pay fines to criminal groups in the region in order to remain open. Church members have been threatened and internally displaced in some cases, and pastors have faced extortion and assassination attempts. Significantly, churches that engage in outreach and assistance to victims of human trafficking, drug and alcohol addicts, or former members of criminal groups have found themselves targets of criminal groups which see church efforts as a threat to their own control, objectives, or activities. Furthermore, many countries in Latin America require government registration of churches, and in the cases of Bolivia and Peru, this registration can be cumbersome, intrusive, and are just plain difficult. So I'm deeply concerned about Bolivia's Law 351, passed in 2013, which forces all religious organizations to reapply for legal standing while imposing burdensome preconditions that appear restrictive to the rights of religious organizations. Moreover, in Nicaragua, reports surfaced in July 2013 that President Ortega was exploiting religious symbols for political gain and using financial pressure on Catholic and Protestant groups to exert political influence. Similarly, in Ecuador, there have been reports of actions by the Ecuadorian government to remove all religious images from regional hospitals and obstruct the work of Catholic priests in prisons. Given the hearing this subcommittee held in July on threats to press freedoms in the Americas and President Correa's actions last week to shut down Fundamedios, an organization with a critical mission to provide information on freedom of expression in Ecuador, I'm troubled at what might be next for a religious organization in Ecuador who dare to diverge from Correa's views. So in June 2014, I sent a letter to Ambassador of Mexico highlighting 2 cases of religious freedom violations and requesting that Mexico prioritize accountability for perpetrators who commit violent crimes under the guise of religion. I'd like to commend Mexico's actions in taking steps to address some of these issues while acknowledging that more work still remains. Given the security environment in Mexico, the Catholic Multimedia Center reported last December that Mexico is the most dangerous country in the world to be a Catholic priest, and 80% of cases involving attacks on priests in Mexico are not resolved. Further, while Mexico's Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, and abuse of Mexico's law of uses and customs has led to widespread cases of religious intolerance, which remain unaddressed today. Furthermore, in Colombia, various NGOs have reported an increase in violence toward religious organizations by criminal paramilitary groups, given the internal armed conflict in Colombia FARC peace talks. Allegedly, this violence has included poisoning, burning of houses, and the closing of about 20 churches, torture, killings, and kidnapping of children for use as child soldiers. In contrast, in Cuba, the persecution of religious organizations have been driven by the government. Although its Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, it has a caveat that this can be restricted if it does not align with the socialist objectives. Today, Cuban government continues to severely restrict religious liberty. Churches must be registered in order to import religious material, meet in houses authorized for worship, or travel abroad for religious purposes. No Protestant religious schools are allowed, and the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons have yet to receive recognition by the government. Last year, 2 pastors were arrested and detained by the police, and earlier this year, the government began enforcing Legal Decree 322 to seize church properties, and in May, the property of Maranatha First Baptist Church was confiscated. Cuban authorities also continue their brutality against religious worshipers, often violent, dragging out women affiliated with the Ladies in White group from Sunday morning services. In conclusion, there are many disturbing reports of religious freedom violations in our own hemisphere, and this does not bode well for the health of these countries, for religious freedom is utterly critical to the protection and development of free societies. As historian Russell Kirk has written, all the aspects of the civilization, of any civilization, arise out of the people's religion. Its politics, its economics, its arts, its sciences, even its simple crafts are the byproduct of religious insights. Consequently, countries that respect religious freedom allow all of these aspects of their cultures to flourish, while those that fail to protect religious freedom will not see these benefits. I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses today on how they rate the Obama administration's priority of religious freedom in the Western Hemisphere, and how and what the U.S. can engage with the countries in the region to support religious freedom. So it should be a very lively hearing, and again, I apologize that we will be interrupted, but I'll now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Sears from New Jersey, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to join you in the words about Chile. It's very difficult to think and live in a country that's constantly receiving earthquakes. And it is such a long country, and we certainly pray for the people in that country. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today we're here to examine challenges to religious freedom in the Americas. While the Western Hemisphere has long enjoyed considerable freedom to practice religion compared to other regions in the world, it is important to remain vigilant and pay attention to troubling trends that may be on the horizon. While leaders like Maduro, Castro, and Correa continue to undermine democratic principles, we must do our part to ensure our faith-based communities are able to live free from persecution. In Mexico, priests are under constant pressure and threat from drug cartels trying to extort money from the church. Additionally, there has been a concerning rise in violence against Protestants and indigenous communities in Mexico. While the culture of impunity in Mexico is strong, we must work to ensure those target faith-based communities aim at doing good in their neighborhoods. And in Argentina, there has been a track record of anti-Semitism with the still unsolved 1994 army bombing in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people. The Cuban regime does not spare religious groups while exercising its total control over the island. They actively monitor and limit religious practices through government-authorized surveillance and harassment. And I'd like to stop here for a minute because what I was looking at, Chairman, before was a very disturbing video that I received recently, where the priest of a church was chasing away from the church ladies in white and called her a mercenary, and that she could not come into that church. To me, being a Catholic, that's very disturbing. The church has a history of being a sanctuary for people through its history, and I cannot understand why a priest would chase someone away from the church. To me, it's just very disturbing. And I'll finish my... When the Pope comes to visit the Western Hemisphere this month, he plans to stop in Cuba before heading to the United States. I hope he uses this as an opportunity to implore the Castro brothers to loosen their grip on the Cuban people who have long been oppressed for too many years. And I look forward to hearing from our panelists today as they examine these and other religious freedom issues in the region, and I thank you.
I want to thank the ranking member, and there's no lighting system in here, so I'm going to do my best to try to keep up with the time. But we've given 5 minutes. Their biographies are in our folder. So Ms. Stengel testified earlier this year. Welcome back to the subcommittee, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing, which I think might be the first time a hearing like this has been held. It's on, yeah. A number of Latin American countries, including Mexico and Peru, have problematic legal requirements for the registration of religious groups. In 2013, Bolivia also adopted legislation requiring registration, but which was expanded to exert control over not just religious groups, but all non-governmental organizations. The law was supposed to enter into force last month, but is now under review by the Constitutional Tribunal, and it forces all religious organizations to re-register. Of most concerns to religious leaders, however, is a clause in the new law which states that religious groups must operate within the parameters of vivir bien, a political ideology incorporating elements of indigenous spiritual beliefs and promoting, and this is a quote, alternatives to capitalism, to modernity, and to development. This clearly poses a problem for many religious organizations whose belief systems do not align with this particular ideology. Problematic anti-cult legislation has also cropped up in Bolivia's southern neighbor, Argentina. CSW has regularly expressed concern about the adoption of anti-cult legislation, which can be used to limit religious freedom. Such legislation often goes beyond targeting criminal actions to criminalizing a system of belief and non-criminal acts of worship. In 2013, the law was used unsuccessfully to target the Pueblo Grande Baptist Church in Rio Tercero. While the laws in many Latin American countries present a potential threat to religious freedom, a state of lawlessness in many countries presents an even more urgent threat. More Catholic priests were killed in Mexico in 2014 than in any other country in the world. According to the Catholic Multimedia Center, which has been documenting attacks on Catholic church leaders since 2000, criminal groups tend to see priests and lay leaders as promoting a way of life that goes contrary to the objectives of the criminal groups in their preaching and ministry. Although not as well documented, the situation for Protestant leaders is similar. In some cases, the criminal groups have prohibited evangelistic work, demanded the active cooperation of church leaders, or attempted to use the church as a front for money laundering or a target for extortion. Uniquely to Mexico, some criminal groups have incorporated a religious element into their ideology, the cult of Santa Muerte, for example, and attempted to force church leaders to endorse these beliefs through word or actions. Church leaders who refuse to comply with these demands are met with serious repercussions. Mexico is one example where widespread criminal violence has had a chilling effect on religious freedom, but similar situations can be found in Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Argentina. I now want to turn to unique religious freedom situations in 3 countries which CSW considers to be a priority for religious freedom advocates in the region. Returning to Mexico, criminal violence is not the only source of religious freedom violation. Religious intolerance in some states, manifested by local leaders attempting to force all inhabitants to adhere to the majority religion, results in widespread and egregious violations of religious freedom. If the government does not intervene, as it rarely does, these situations often escalate to violence, including arbitrary detention, physical assault, and expropriation or destruction of property, and end in mass expulsion and forced displacement. Moving now to Colombia. The internal conflict in this country, which has gone on now for more than a half a century, has also had a direct impact on religious freedom. I have already mentioned criminal violence perpetuated in Colombia by neo-paramilitary groups, one of which, the Black Eagles, issued public death threats to civil society leaders, including 5 named Protestant leaders in the Atlantic Coast region earlier this year. The group also named all Protestant churches in the cities of Barranquilla and Sincelejo as military targets. On the other side of the conflict, leftist guerrillas, the FARC and the ELN, have historically severely restricted religious freedom in areas under their influence or control. In some cases, they have prohibited all Christian activity and persecuted and even killed Christian leaders who defied these orders. In other cases, while not prohibiting Christian activity across the board, they have imposed severe restrictions. In Colombia, state actors have also been accused of violations of religious freedom. Despite numerous rulings by the Constitutional Court that the right to conscientious objection on religious grounds to obligatory military service is protected by the Constitution, military forces have not respected this right and have forcibly inducted young men who hold strong religious beliefs that prohibit them from taking up arms. I conclude now with Cuba, where religious organizations and their activities come under the authority of the Office of Religious Affairs of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party. Religious groups must seek permission from this office for things ranging from the right to own a vehicle to something as simple as expanding a bathroom or repairing a roof. The office, in turn, uses the granting or withholding of these permits to manipulate religious groups. Church leaders of legally recognized denominations report harassment, discrimination, and threats from government officials as a daily part of their ministry. Religious groups that do not have legal recognition are severely persecuted and threatened with confiscation or destruction of their property. Over the past 5 years, CSW has documented a continuous and sharp rise in religious freedom violations in Cuba. Much of this is rooted in the decades-long government policy of attempting to separate Cubans linked to human rights groups and pro-democracy movements from bodies of faith. In recent years, more and more church leaders have defied this policy and welcomed all Cubans, regardless of their political beliefs, into their churches. This has become a flashpoint for religious freedom violations, perhaps most obviously manifested in the violent, arbitrary detention each weekend of women linked to the Ladies in White movement in order to prevent them from attending Sunday Mass. The general global perception that Latin America is a Christian region of the world with strong Western values has often led to violations of religious freedom, many of them serious, being overlooked. Well-thought-out policies by the United States to promote freedom of religion or belief in the region, carried out in consultation and cooperation with civil society on the ground, could have real potential to make a change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Petri, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will summarize my written testimony. The majority of all Latin American citizens is formally Christian, but actively practicing Christians, that is Christians who regularly attend church, are a minority. And this minority is specifically vulnerable to suffer human rights abuses. As far as the legal framework is concerned, there are no major obstacles to religious freedom in the vast majority of Latin American countries, with the exception of Cuba. But from the perspective of human security, the enforcement of religious freedom poses challenges. Religious freedom in Latin America is restricted by 3 dynamics. The first is organized crime. The main feature of organized crime is the creation of a climate of impunity, anarchy, and corruption, in which actively practicing Christians are vulnerable because their behavior, which is based on the biblical worldview, is contrary to the greed of organized crime. Of course, organized crime affects societies as a whole, and not only Christians, but actively practicing Christians possess a specific vulnerability for suffering human rights abuses. The targeting of Christians by criminal organizations is generally motivated by a combination of 2 elements. Firstly, people involved in organized crime view Christians who openly oppose their activities as a threat, especially when Christians get involved in social programs or in politics. Secondly, criminal organizations know that the Christian faith is not compatible with their ideals. They fear Christians will influence members of the community or even members of their own organizations to oppose their activities. All denominations of Christianity can become victims of organized crime, though it affects mostly the more outspoken Christians who fulfill leadership positions. Let me mention a few examples on Mexico. In many states of Mexico, violence is pervasive, but affects actively practicing Christians to a high degree. Churches and other Christian institutions are often seen as revenue centers by drug cartels. The extortion of priests, pastors, but also Christian business owners is commonplace. Attending church services increases the threat of kidnapping, and youths are particularly at risk of being recruited into gangs. Social initiatives are also faced with major threats, especially initiatives that enter the area of influence of criminal organizations. Drug rehabilitation programs or youth work are a direct threat to the market and influence of drug cartels, and therefore increase the vulnerability of Christians engaging in these programs. From personal research on the ground, I can confirm that there is widespread and sophisticated surveillance and monitoring by members of drug cartels within churches. And now turning to Colombia, in many parts of Colombia, similarly to Mexico, organized crime is responsible for demonstrable threats to certain forms of religious behavior. The second dynamic that restricts religious freedom in the Americas is the presence of hostilities against conversion to Christianity in indigenous areas, especially in Mexico and Colombia. Converts to Christianity are regularly threatened, excluded from access to basic social services, beaten and displaced by tribal leaders, and they are not given sufficient protection by their government. The third dynamic that restricts religious freedom in the Americas is communism. In Cuba, pressure on Christians continues in the form of harassment, strict surveillance, and discrimination, including the occasional imprisonment of Christian leaders. Religious practice is monitored, and all church services are infiltrated by spies. In Venezuela, the pressure on Christians is subtle, but any organization which is influential is restricted by the government. For years, the Venezuelan administration has attempted to shut down private Catholic education in favor of public schools. And in Bolivia, through administrative and bureaucratic obstacles, Christians are also restricted in their freedom to exercise their right to worship. Your Excellencies, I recommend the following. First, I recommend that the specific vulnerability of actively practicing Christians is taken into consideration in U.S. foreign policy and by the U.S. Congress in performing its oversight function. The US government should make the reduction of risks for Christians caused by organized crime an integral part of its foreign policy. Second, special attention should be given to the issue of structural violence, impunity, and corruption, as Mexico and other Latin American states are not always diligent enough in terms of investigating issues related to violations of freedom of religion and expression. Third, the US government should urge the Colombian government to include religious freedom in the agenda of the ongoing peace talks with the FARC guerrillas. Fourth, the US government must put pressure on the Colombian government to counter the abuses in the realm of religious freedom of the constitutional provision that grants autonomy to indigenous territories. Fifth, I also recommend that advantage should be taken of the recent developments in diplomatic relations with Cuba to specifically address the religious freedom situation in that country. Sixth, finally, the US government should work together with Latin American states to create a system in which churches and Christian leaders who are victims of extortion feel safe to denounce threats against them.
Thank you, Mr. Petri. Mr. Cole, you recognize.
Thank you, Congressman. My name is Richard Cole, Foreign Policy Advisor, Latin America and Global Trade for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I would like to thank the Honorable Representative Jeff Duncan, Chairman of the Subcommittee, and the Honorable Representative Albio Series, Ranking Member, for the opportunity to testify today on challenges to religious freedom. I will be summarizing my written statement submitted for the record of this hearing, and I would respectfully request that my statement be added to the record. The bishops of the United States are deeply disturbed by the terrible human consequences of violence in Latin America and the effects of violence on religious freedom and human rights in the region. Many Catholic bishops, priests, religious and lay workers have been the victims over the years of assassinations, violence, death threats, and hostility, often directed at them as a consequence of their work as pastors and defenders of the rights of their people. The gospel and Catholic social teaching call us to defend poor and marginalized communities and to oppose the persecution that results from a criminal response to this ministry. Catholic social teaching has consistently called for democracy, human rights, and robust civil society institutions. In promoting these noble objectives, many church leaders and workers have paid a grievous price. Catholic social teaching is founded on the sanctity of the life and dignity of all persons. All are created in the image and likeness of God. The state and its political structures exist to serve the human person, and in particular to foster the common good. All human persons have rights that are of divine origin. It's as a result of these core religious beliefs, when acting in solidarity to support the legitimate claims to life and dignity of all peoples in Latin America, that many church leaders and workers have become the targets of violence. Let me give you examples. In Latin America, the exercise of religious freedom has been challenged by state and society throughout the region. In some countries, as has already been noted, such as Cuba and Venezuela, the free exercise of religion has been suppressed, with religious believers imprisoned and persecuted for their beliefs. In other countries, religious freedom is given wider respect, but continues to be challenged by political leaders and groups who seek to drive religious believers or actors out of public life or to limit the role of religious belief in public debate. These include restrictions on participation of religious groups in political discussions, and it includes laws which fail to extend conscience and religious exemptions to individuals. A great example is the case of Article 130 of the Mexican Constitution, which prohibits religious organizations from challenging or criticizing the laws of the state. In many countries in Latin America, the challenges to the church and to organized religion, as also has been noted, come not only from the government, but from the operation of criminal, guerrilla, and paramilitary actors engaged in violence against their fellow citizens. In defending the right to life and dignity of its innocent and tormented people, the church's bishops, priests, and religious lay workers have often become the victims of retaliatory violence at the hand of these criminal groups. According to a report by FIDES, the International Service of the Pontifical Mission Societies, 22 pastors and care workers, 19 priests, 1 religious sister, and 2 lay persons were killed worldwide in 2013, almost double the number killed the year before. For the 5th consecutive year, Latin America had the highest number of such deaths in 2013. In the Americas, 15 priests were killed, 7 in Colombia, 4 in Mexico, 1 each in Brazil, Venezuela, Panama, and Haiti. By 2014, the number of priests killed in Mexico increased to 9, making that country, as has been noted, the most dangerous nation in the world to be a Catholic priest. In solidarity visits to Cuba and Venezuela, as well as to Colombia, Peru, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, U.S. CCB delegations have witnessed firsthand the remarkable spirituality and courageous actions of many church leaders, priests, religious, and lay workers. In Peru, this threat of violence has extended to Archbishop Pedro Barreto in connection with his work defending the poor from the violence caused by unregulated mining operations in his archdiocese. Bishop Alvaro Ramazzini of Guatemala likewise has received numerous threats on his life for his work in support of indigenous communities. Bishop Raul Vera of Mexico has courageously identified the criminal elements, be they narcotics traffickers, gang members, or local government officials, that murdered innocent Mexican citizens in numerous slayings. In Honduras, a large number of priests and religious spoke to us about the violence they had witnessed or experienced personally as a result of defending the rights of local communities to protest against dangerous mining operations. Comparable threats have been received concerning religious leaders and workers in the Central American region who have spoken in support of their afflicted people. In this way, these brave individuals mirror the profound and powerful example of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was recently beatified in a moving ceremony in El Salvador. He gave his life in 1980 defending the rights of the Salvadoran people to peace, freedom, and dignity, and many church leaders and followers have followed in his footsteps. To quote from a letter from Bishop Richard Pace to Secretary of State John Kerry, "My brother bishops in Central America have urged us to encourage alternatives to the militarization of U.S. assistance and to instead emphasize economic opportunity. The United States must recognize our own contributions to the crisis which exists in the region and support more effective programs that reduce drug usage here at home. The regulation of gun exports, coupled with criminal justice reforms that foster rehabilitation rather than retribution, need to be implemented by our states and our federal government." Congressman, your roles as representatives of this great nation brings great responsibilities. The decision to support justice for the peoples of Latin America is of crucial importance to these efforts at addressing the root causes of this crisis. All must act in a way that respects the dignity of all human persons and enables the proper participation of all Latin American citizens, reducing conflict and division. As members of this esteemed Congress, you can play a vital and life-saving role in solidarity with the Catholic Church and the people of this region. This can be accomplished by effectuating budgetary decisions that support peaceful development, economic growth, and the rule of law, and by addressing the grave problems of human, narcotics, and weapons trafficking over our borders. Thank you for providing crucial moral leadership to assist the people of Latin America in creating viable and prosperous societies. In this way, human rights and the strengthening of robust civil societies will be secured, which will lead to more just and equitable development reflecting the common patrimony of all God's children. The USCCB stands ready to work with you and with the Church in Latin America in bringing such hopeful prospects to a fruitful resolution. Thank you again.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses. They have just called votes, so we're going to recess probably for about 30 minutes. There's 3 votes, and we'll come back. Hopefully Mr. Luna will be here. We'll take his testimony, and then we'll get into the question session of this. So if you'll bear with us, we'll stand in recess. Okay, we'll reconvene the hearing. Appreciate y'all's patience, and we'll recognize Mr. Luna for an opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I value what you're doing here. The fact that you're focusing on religious liberty in Latin America is very important for Latin America and for religious liberty, as well as what Rabbi David Epstein does in Latin America and all over the world in his role as ambassador. And I think, I've been involved for many years with the State Department, the report on religious rights, human rights, and these three offer great service to the continent, so thank you. I briefly want to share on behalf of CONEL. CONEL is Spanish for Confraternidad Evangélica Latina, Latin World Evangelical Alliance. We used to be Latin American, called CONELA, Latin America, but Latin identity is now global. What this means is that in the United States, if you've heard of NHCLC, Samuel Rodriguez, they are CONEL in the United States, U.S. Hispanics. About 40,000 churches represented. We serve a community of approximately 500,000 churches in Latin America. Those we have certified. We actually, as of 2010, we think the number is actually closer to 700,000, but we say 500,000 certified, the missional community we serve. Our board members for our unity are the regional leaders, representing approximately 80% of the churches in Latin America, a local church being, anywhere from 20 and 30 members to large churches of 1,000 to 2,000. Various countries have churches of 7,000 to 100,000. Yes, one local church that meets in homes and then in the stadium on the weekend. So this is the church in Latin America. We're 21 nations, 15 island nations in addition, about 500 million people. So the issue of religious liberty is very important, and I think I'm more connected to the local church in terms of especially the evangelical church, but also in our relations with our Catholic brothers and others whom we meet both at a regional or at a local level. There's just three very small things that I want to point out in this opportunity to be here. One is the situation of religious liberty, de jure, de facto, and policy opportunities. De jure, I think our colleagues have spoken well to that. There's a lot of documentation, including your own staff, I'm assuming. De jure, most countries in Latin America have adopted the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 is part of everybody's agenda, and so it's present. And if the world could be safe for religious liberty because we have constitution and laws, then we would not even need to have a hearing about what issues and challenges we face. But obviously it's not. You've heard from our colleagues, I think, about Mexico. To give you one idea, in Mexico, every time there's an expulsion in San Juan Chamula or anywhere in the Mexican state, 18 laws are broken. Every time there's one expulsion. This is from a human rights lawyer that has been working there for decades. So 30,000 people in one community of 90,000 people have been evicted. And that's 180,000 laws broken. So sometimes it's not the fact that we have laws, it's the enforcement of laws that is the great challenge. So that's why I would like to focus on de facto. De facto is the reality on the ground. In this reality on the ground, I've personally been involved in the last 35 years. Being involved on the ground, I've been in Cuba where I've been kicked out for being part of the CIA because everything that is not controlled, by the state becomes that. Nevertheless, acknowledge these are changing times. There's improvements in many areas. But in Colombia, that means being involved in conflict areas at a very local level, getting to know the actors through Colombian peace talks, as my friend Ms. Stangl here, with left-wing guerrillas, the right-wing paramilitaries, and finding out again from the base communities. Everywhere I've been, there's a local church of these 500,000 churches. The jure situation is one, but the de facto, what does it look like on the ground, is important. And it's important to highlight the two types of oppositions that we've had historically and currently. One is revolutionary extremists. They're not only in the Middle East. In Latin America, we've been dealing with them for over 50 years, 60 years, and more, depending on the country. And revolutionary extremists put the church at in the middle of a conflict. The church is caught in a crossfire, we say. And as the church is caught in a crossfire, as you've heard, we have expulsions, we have deaths, we have 1.5 million refugees in a place like Colombia. We have 120 Catholic priests, over 250 evangelical pastors killed because they're caught in a crossfire. Because in a situation like conflict, people say you're either with me or against me. And some people, revolutionaries of the left and other counter-revolutionaries, if you will, of the right, they both put the church in that position. And in this setting, it's been wonderful to be able to document with the State Department cases. We've had histories of cases documented yearly that put this, as we say, what happens to one in a local place in the middle of nowhere happens to all of us. And I think it's very beneficial. De jure and de facto, two realities. But I want to affirm as I was looking over the goals you have for this committee, in two very brief recommendations. The first recommendation of where religious liberty is going needs to have one more word added to the religious, which is religious equality. In Latin America, the values that we have as Latins, God, family, places many of our communities, like the ones represented here from our Catholic Church, from human NGOs and on this side and that, places us together to focus on two areas of religious equality. One, I think that we would focus on a religious equality that where we can express with our religious liberty that we have our values. For instance, what that means specifically is that in areas of same-sex marriage, in areas of abortion, evangelicals, Catholics, NGOs, and Latin culture in general has declared itself very publicly. There's a study of 12 nations in Latin America, 45 globally, attitudes and behaviors of youth, where 82% of the youth in Latin America declared themselves to be part of what can be called traditional, by other definition, biblical family. So a religious equality issue is tied to religious liberty. We need to be able to express this because there is now UN policy, sometimes US policy, that tells us we have to accept a United States or a United Nations view of this versus our own. So this issue of religious liberty and religious equality, there's a great concern and a generational concern that we're able to express this and be respected in our religious liberty options to believe and to organize ourselves as such. We believe it's very important with our Catholic brothers to stand, I think, with great respect for the law, great respect for people in democracy, to each require their own actions, understanding that, but we want to express these values. I think the issue of religious equality is an issue also of what governments will do with the growing evangelical church. In 1900, 1% of Latin America was evangelical. Today, depending on the country, 5% lowest to 50%, maybe 15% as you look as an average in Latin America. So what do you do when, as a state, this is a question for state, it's not a question of a church to church, of the state, what do you do when the official church receives grants for education, receives $1 million grants to exist as an organization, has the opportunity to import, has the opportunity to be legal, to be tax exempt, and the growing evangelical churches don't? This to me brings up the issue, which is very important for the 500,000 churches in Latin America, of religious equality. What does religious equality look like? There's a great example in the case of Chile. Chile is the only country that has passed a religious equality law. To do so, evangelical leaders that wanted to find solutions, not blame, Catholic leaders, as a matter of fact, the two top lawyers was a Catholic lawyer and an evangelical lawyer, got together to look at it as a state issue of how to make religious liberty and religious equality, what does it need to look like in the 21st century? And in the case of Chile, they passed the only religious equality law in Latin America. This means that evangelicals have access to the chaplaincy in prisons as well as in the military. It means they could exist legally in the same way. And this question is not only for the evangelical church, but for all minority religions. The changing face requires, and if there's one recommendation that I would love the committee to consider is, how do we do that? And how do we do that in brotherhood? And how can we partner for that? And towards that end, count on us, CONEL, as a group that would very much like to be part of a solution of anybody working this issue. The other issue, very briefly, we focus on children. Children are at the forefront of expressing or of living every problem that has to do with sexual trafficking, every problem that has to do with gangs. 82,000 just in two countries of Latin America, 82,000 gang members. In El Salvador, 17,000 gang members stopped the functioning of the country for one day. So when children are victims of these gang members, where narco-trafficking, which went beyond Colombia and the Andean countries and northern Mexico, as we all know, and the children become what they call the mules, the messengers and the transporters. The children are placed in very precarious situation. This very precarious situation has actually caused Latin America to live an immigration crisis in every country through refugees, 1.5 million, 2 million, 100,000, different countries. And as we live these situations, we're looking, can we agree on the rights of children? And with this I finish. What is the recommendation? I have a meeting next month in Chiapas, Mexico, where 3 Central American presidents, where people involved in refugee and children at risk, children as victims of sexual trafficking, 57 million that have to work, as children. We want to adopt principles that would allow us to recommend, to promote, to work for in every country. I will just read to you what they are, and then I will finish with that. Principles towards children. This is my wrap-up. 4 points. 1, principles that respect the God-given dignity of every person, protects the unity of the immediate family, respects, and especially the children, respects the rule of law, and guarantees secure national borders. Our idea is that we want to ask us Latin countries to respect these 4 issues. And insofar as religious liberty and human rights focused on children and the church's response to them, if there's a way that through the work of your committee and of the United States government, we could find a common place to do that, that would be very welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
I want to thank the panelists for their opening statements. We'll now move into the question portion of the hearing. Mr. Luna, I'll start with you. In your opinion, where other than the United States, and we can have an argument about religious liberty in the United States, which I think we ought to talk about as well, but where can one go to feel like they can worship freely in the Western Hemisphere? What countries lead in the realm of religious freedom? We know the bad actors, right? So we talk about Cuba, we can talk about Nicaragua. Who are some of the what are some of the good actors?
Chile is very strong. As I say, if there's a leader, both de jure, de facto, in the Latin continent, it's Chile.
For all religions, or
For
just
all-
more Catholicism, or
For all religions. There's a movement amongst evangelical leaders to not think of of course, to represent our communities, which are evangelical, but to look at the issue of religious liberty and equality as for all religions. And we form part of committees at a national level that are, of all the different religions so that the same law could apply to the religions.
So Chile's one. Who's another?
Chile is one. All the other ones, I would say we have challenges in, which is why we
Paraguay,
need to
Uruguay, any Caribbean country, Suriname,
focus.
Guyana, any of that? Brazil? I'm asking. I don't know.
Yes, Brazil has had a strong tradition of religious respect. I think all countries have two realities. One, where they are models and they are living models, especially in the cities and in certain sectors. But they also have the challenge, which is why I think we need to focus on religious liberty and equality for the new challenges.
Yeah, let me ask other panelists if you'll chime in. Who do you see as the good actors?
I do think actually Brazil that you mentioned was one of the leading lights in the region. There has just been an effort to submit for consideration a new bill on religious freedom in Brazil. They already had a very good framework, but they wanted to make sure it was the best it could be, and they wanted to be the model for the rest of Latin America. There is something of a battle in some of these countries with militant secularism, and as Mr. Luna and as Mr. Cole said, kind of trying to banish religious speech from the public sphere. You do see that to an extent in Brazil, but I'd say as far as worship on a Sunday morning or Friday at mosque or Saturday at the synagogue, Brazil's probably one of the leaders, as well as Chile.
Right. Mr. Petri?
Well, I think, as I said, as far as national legislation is concerned, there's really not that much wrong with Latin American countries. And really, in my testimony, what I try to convey is that we should broaden the scope of religious freedom, not only look at it from the legal perspective. And I don't think there are that many problems in Latin America. Of course, the good students really are Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, which is the country that is my home. But I think from a legal perspective, there's not that much that is wrong. But from the human security perspective, there's a lot more that is going on, and that's something that very often is.
Let me get Mr. Cole
Sure.
on the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd just like to follow up on Mr. Petri's very wise observation that I'd like to offer up the church in Colombia and Colombia generally as being an example of how religious freedom operates in a way that vindicates the rights of the common people. The church in Colombia, particularly under the leadership of Cardinal Salazar, has, as you know, been very instrumental in helping to negotiate a settlement with the FARC, and through its Pastoral Social has also been very active in trying to develop a form of social services and social outreach to impoverished people. We were in Bogota just a year or so ago, and it's really wonderful to see the work that happens there. I'd offer up Colombia as a great example of how effective religious freedom can affect the facts and the root causes on the ground.
Well, thank you all for that. Violence has been talked about a lot. I think the ranking member mentioned, and probably will mention again, a video of someone being pulled out of a church, a white lady being pulled out of the church, ladies in white rather, by a priest. Violence, how it leads to persecution. I guess I'm asking, is this more government-sponsored violence? Is this, we heard about gang violence and the cartel and other things, but do you see, what's the balance there between a criminal element violence and government-sponsored violence across the region, not just focusing on Cuba, but across the region? Is it more government-sponsored? Is it more criminal elements? Ms. Tangle?
I think it's a very complex mix. I think in most countries it would be criminal groups, however, exceptions in Cuba and in Mexico. In Cuba, you see kind of government paramilitary groups that come in plainclothes pretending to be civilians who also attack ladies in white and try and prevent them from attending mass. And that's definitely, although they're not wearing government uniforms, a government-orchestrated campaign of violence. In Mexico, on the very local level, in certain regions, there's a campaign of violence carried out by local officials, so not top government officials, but local, maybe a mayor, a local town council. And that is often met with impunity, which gives the impression that the higher-up government either doesn't care enough or endorses that kind of violence. But in the other countries, it would be much more criminal, non-government actors.
That's really not what I want to ask. Let's ask this. Have you seen evidence of the State Department or local embassy officials engaging with governments in the region on these issues to encourage governments to revise their regulations or their laws that make church registration more difficult for minority religious groups? So we've got governments that are requiring churches to register. We talked about that in your statements and mine. Do you see the U.S. engaging those governments and saying, look, church registration is counterproductive to religious freedom? How do you see our State Department acting on this? Mr. Petri, you look like you want to answer.
I think the Obama administration has really not paid that much attention to religious freedom, apart from the annual publication.
Well, they hadn't paid much attention to this region in general, but...
Yes, of course. But apart from the annual publication of the International Religious Freedom Report, there's just not that much that has happened in the field of religious freedom in the Americas. And I think that's an important point I want to make. I think as I said earlier, the full scope of religious freedom is not taken into account by the International Religious Freedom Report of the State Department, because what you see in Latin America, and I think Cuba is really an exception, because there the persecution is mostly state-sponsored, but if you look at the other countries, persecution is not based that much on religious identity or on church attendance, but more on behavior. So it's your religious convictions that make you vulnerable to suffer human rights abuses. But identity as such, just the fact that you own a Bible or that you go to church, is not enough to be persecuted. That's not the dynamic. That's why religious freedom violations are often misunderstood in Latin America. And that's really what I want you to take away from this, that's actually one very important dimension that is very present in Latin America, and that should be taken into account.
All right, my time's up. I'm going to yield to the ranking member, and we'll come around for the second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we usually have people from the State Department here, and I'm one of those individuals that think that democracy is in trouble in Central and South America. I think we're going the other way. I was just wondering if suppression of religion goes along with that we're going in the wrong way in all these countries.
One of the things, Mr. Series, is that it's more sophisticated now. They will never, at one point, say in Cuba, it was very clear. Atheism and religion is their enemy. In today's world, it's a fine for something you're doing. It's a church in Caracas, Venezuela, a very prominent church, was going to be taken over because they didn't fulfill certain local ordinances. So I think now, people, because of human rights, people are very careful not to say, I'm going after you because of religion. But what's behind there is that, like in these types of attacks, you know, that is through mobs, which are done by the government. The situation in Cuba is, I would say, has some parallels in Venezuela, for instance, in this respect. So there is definitely an opposition to church, but it's more sophisticated, and you know how to do that. And I think we can report this. In my contact with local embassies and placing it in the international report has been very key. But as far as how to promote something different, I have not seen evidence of that.
The wrong way?
Well, I think that in some countries there are certainly increased challenges, and I think those challenges, as we've heard already this afternoon, come from two different angles. One is the governmental policy that can challenge, whether it's in the case of a Cuba or in the case of Mexico, where there has been historically over hundreds of years efforts at secularization, and where frankly the Catholic Church has been under extreme duress, the Cristero Wars in the 1920s, the victim of a great amount of violence in Mexico. I also think that, as we've also heard, in many countries, Colombia, Peru, other parts of Latin America, certainly in Central America, the challenges come from the issues of poverty, narcotics trafficking, arms trafficking, political violence, gang warfare. And to address those, we won't be able to address them through legislative solutions or even political solutions. Rather, we need solid economic and developmental causes to be addressed. in that regard, for instance, I had an opportunity to meet with Cardinal Salazar, whom I mentioned, who was such a supporter of the FARC negotiations, and I asked him, how can we as a church in the United States support you in Colombia in reaching a peaceful resolution of these issues? And he said, you can cut down on the drug demand from the United States because your insatiable demand for drugs from the United States is killing our people. And then I would just finally add that we've, as a conference, been a long supporter of the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act of 2015. We believe that enactment of that bill would be very helpful in terms of enhancing political diplomacy, in the preservation of religious freedom, and in vindicating greater education for State Department officials to recognize the importance of religious freedom. So.
Yes, well, Mr. Sears, I think I agree with you that there are huge challenges to the democracies in Latin America. I think Latin America, the democratization...
Go hand in hand.
Of course. The democratization 30 years ago that started in Latin America led to electoral democracies, but quality of democracy, there's still a lot of work to be done, especially in the field of service delivery in all social aspects. And one of those elements is, of course, religious freedom, the protection, the enforcement of religious freedom. So it's all very nice on paper, but the enforcement of religious rights is a major challenge. And together with that, the corruption, infiltration of security and justice systems is also a big issue in some of the countries in Latin America. So yes, I agree with you that both things go hand in hand. Yeah.
Yeah, as to your question on Central America, and if we're going backwards, I was in El Salvador last weekend at a conference on violence in Latin America and how this is affecting religious freedom. And what we've seen in El Salvador and the countries surrounding it is that the levels of violence and the government response in some cases is so extreme that the impetus of society is also very bad. One very prominent denominational leader, Pastor Mario Vega, earlier this year was named on a web page supposedly run by a kind of government death squads, named and threatened because of his speaking out about some of these policies and defending the churches. He said to me, in a country like El Salvador, where you have such high levels of criminal gangs and their activities, it's impossible as a pastor or a priest not to have some contact with them. At children's events, 90% of the children are children of gang members. And so you're living every day in your ministry with that dynamic. At the same time, illicit association is now considered a crime by the government. And so a pastor who is trying to work with these communities, trying to transform these communities, or a priest can also be in danger, unfortunately, from the government side of being accused of illicit association. So it is definitely going backwards in that sense.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Now the chair will go to Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any particular place in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere where it's more egregious, the interference of religious freedom? Is there any one area where it's more egregious than the others? To anyone, if you're aware of.
For our CSW, there are different types of religious freedom violations, but our 3 priority countries in the country we consider to be the worst at the moment are Cuba, Mexico, and Colombia.
Yeah, for Open Doors, those are the same 3 priority countries as well. There's many trends that are occurring at the same time in different countries and to different extents, but those 3 countries are really the highest priority as far as religious freedom is concerned. Yeah.
Well, when you think about Cuba, the administration has just resumed relationship with Cuba without any demands on improvements of human rights in the Cuban government. Have we seen any places where there's been improvement at all?
You're correct. In Cuba, we've seen 0 improvements in religious freedom since these negotiations began, unfortunately. As far as improvements in other countries, we have seen some improvements in Colombia as a result, I think, of the peace talks and some government efforts there. And there are positive noises coming from Mexico, very much due, I think, to pressure from the chairman of this committee and other members of Congress who have raised this issue consistently and strongly with the Mexican government.
Well, there are improvements, but at the same time, there are also deteriorations on different fields at the same time. So I think, as also mentioned, I think we should really, or you should take advantage of the dialogue that is now starting with Cuba to really address religious freedom in that country. And some things, and just looking at Mexico or Colombia, some things have improved. especially relationships between churches are much better than in the past. Legislation has improved, but then organized crime is really putting, as I said, actively practicing Christians under threat in these countries more and more. So as things go better, other things go worse.
My understanding from one of the witnesses' testimony that some of it's governmental intolerance of religious freedom, and some of it is guerrilla intolerance that's, I don't know if it's supported by government or ignored by governments. Besides the hearings that we have here, what could the United States government do to help?
I would just also like to add to the list of countries we should focus on Venezuela, from the Catholic perspective, a country that is one in which the Catholic Church is the victim of a tremendous amount of political and other pressure, and where one can only hope that political developments will evolve in a way over the next couple of years to restore that country to a fuller expression of religious freedom. In terms of recommendations, I'll just mention again that from our perspective, the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act of 2015 would be a great step forward in terms of enabling the State Department and other political actors within our government to vindicate more effectively religious freedom around the world.
I think that the focus haven't been on documentation, as I said, was a great contribution, but the word here was mentioned enforcement. So I affirm the support of this act because, you know, it moves us along, but the idea of enforcement, I think, is the direction that we could move to. And I also add, from the evangelical perspective, Venezuela as well. You know, criminal elements are always handled by people of power and authority. The guy that you hire or the mob you hire is there at somebody's hiring. So we've seen a great increase of that. And in the midst of that, we've seen great growth in the church. A recent newspaper article from the government said that 1 out of every 5 Venezuelans is now an evangelical. And it's, you know, a difficult position for them to be in.
I think all the efforts that are being done currently to strengthen states should actively integrate the perspective of religious freedom much more than is the case now. That's I think my main recommendation, understanding the full scope of religious freedom violations in Latin America. And then, as I said, take advantage of the current dialogue with Cuba to address religious freedom. Also, take advantage of the current dialogue between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, and try to urge Colombia to put religious freedom on their agenda as well. Just taking advantage of the current context. And there was another recommendation I made, I think, is that the US government should work together with Latin American states to create a system in which Christian leaders feel free to denounce threats they are victims of, threats against them. Because that's also something, if they cannot do that in their own country because there is corruption, because there is impunity, because they are often too afraid to denounce and to report what they're facing, there should be an alternative system for the cases to get out.
Do any of you think that economic pressure will help the governments realize that they have to do something about the oppression of religious freedom in their countries? One of the fears always our country putting economic pressure on another country is that the government doesn't suffer, the people suffer. And so whatever pressures we put on, whether we stop trade or whether we stop sending resources there, it's actually the people who we're trying to help are the ones that actually get harmed. Does anybody believe that some economic pressure on any of these countries would make them turn around and realize that losing American support economically isn't worth what they're doing in their country?
Speaking from our perspective at the U.S. conference, we would strongly advise against the imposition of sanctions or economic pressures for 2 reasons. First of all, we do not believe that historically economic sanctions have been effective. Secondly, we believe that at the root cause of many of these difficulties, the violence, the political, economic instability, the trafficking issues, resides a tremendous economic challenge that those societies must face. We believe that proper economic development, integral economic development, is the path forward for these countries, and to impose sanctions on them that would cripple them in the development of their economies would be counterproductive and we think lead to worsening conditions.
And just add that the idea of not sanctions but incentives, economic incentives for those that deal with these issues is important, but I think there's one realization that must be made. One thing is dealing with the government, the other thing is dealing with government officials. Official government policy may be right, but government officials, to just give you one very brief example, in Chiapas, President Salinas de Gortari at that time went to Chiapas to deal with the caciques, these landlords, that kicked out 30,000 people. Those community leaders are called caciques. When he went, because of economic incentive, that if we pass the free trade agreement, it'll be good for Mexico from his end. People in the States, some thought it would be good for here, and everybody was in agreement. And he went down and says, hey, you guys really need to watch it here. Talk to a few of the presidents, local presidents, community presidents. He says it would be really good if you could, you guys could like tone it down and respect the laws, because they have their own laws that they implement. And this is what the community leader told the president. Mr. President, you go preside in Mexico City, but I'm the president here. So if there's an incentive, in this case, both sides saw an incentive with the free trade agreement, and the president's motivated and his administration's motivated, it's the local official level. And how do you help them through documentation and some way of enforcement, help those local people that are facing the situations, even when the government says that they're on your side, but sometimes they're powerless. So how to do incentives and how to help those people that are actually facing, where if they come out of the shadow, they're going to, it's going to be a death threat. I mean, it's that simple. Their kid's going to be taken. Their kid's going to be shot. Especially Central America, you mentioned this happens all the time. So how to help that situation, I think, is a challenge.
Yes, I would also advise against economic sanctions. Instead, I would really focus on helping the states to reform their institutions and to rebuild and strengthen their democratic institutions, security system, justice system. But adopting an integrated approach that really pays attention to the enforcement of religious rights. I think that's the priority, not economic sanctions, but focusing on helping states to become more effective at guaranteeing the enforcement of religious rights.
Or as opposed to sanctions, as the gentleman said, incentives. There's still economic pressure. I don't think I have any more time, Mr. Chairman, but if I do, I yield it.
I think the gentleman, you hit on one of the points I was going to bring up in my second round, is that, as I said in my opening statement, the ability to worship and exercise one's faith without fear of attack, censure, bribery, or government reprisals is one of the most important metrics of freedom in any country. And I appreciate y'all talking about the impacts of religious freedom on economics and whatnot. So, shifting gears a little bit, let me ask you this. In Mexico, we've got the law of common use, law of uses and customs. How can the Mexican government better monitor the implementation of the law of uses and customs to ensure it is practiced in accordance with human rights guarantees in state and federal law? Ms. Stengel.
The Mexican government already has very good mechanisms to monitor these cases, and they are aware of the cases. The issue, again, as was mentioned before, is implementation, rule of law, and impunity. There are excellent state human rights commissions that monitor and actively work on these issues. There's a great National Human Rights Commission that also does very good work. The problem is, although these are kind of quasi-government bodies, the government itself never implements what they do, what they recommend, and the cases they're working on. So I think the breakdown there is not so much the monitoring, but enforcing the law. People who commit crimes for religious reasons don't get an exemption just because they put a banner of religion over the top. Everyone should be held to account in the court of law, and helping Mexico strengthen its justice system, I think, would be a big step forward on that.
We've talked a lot about Bolivia and Ecuador and Mexico and Colombia and Venezuela. I'm meeting with some folks from Haiti in a little while, and then the Prime Minister a little bit after that. So when I think about the hemisphere, I noticed, we talked about the Americas. The title of the hearing is about the Americas in general. We seem to be very southernly focused here on Central America, Latin America in general. What about the Caribbean? What about Haiti and the Dominican Republic? What about Bermuda or Canada? Those aren't mentioned in these discussions. How do you feel about religious freedom going into my meeting with Haiti? How's it perceived in Haiti? What's the impact of religious freedom, or is there oppression of any sort in Haiti or the DR or any of the Caribbean nations that I need to be aware of? And I ask all of you that. Mr. Luna?
Reflecting on your question, one more country to add to movement in the right direction is Peru as well. They've also faced conflict. They've done a lot of work and move in the right direction. In the case of Caribbean, I think Dominican Republic is a case for strong relationship, state, church, on behalf of religious liberty and human rights. There's a strong presence and a strong desire in both groups. In the case of Haiti, this is from a local church contact. You know, the issues that they mostly focus on are development and the such. There was a time when any political party, you know, in the struggles that Haiti has had, can make anyone an enemy. And if you chose not to be corrupt, or if you chose not to help a certain party do what it asked you to do because you're in the neighborhood, it became a death threat and an eviction. But especially after the earthquake, we've seen at least that communities, because of a maybe shared common need, have come together more and work more intentionally towards being problem solvers and problem makers from a local church level perspective.
Mr. Petri?
Yes, well, actually, compared with the Caribbean, I think Colombia is a very extreme case as far as the issue of religious freedom in indigenous territories is concerned. Colombia has, I think, in the whole continent, the most far-reaching, gives the highest degree, highest level of autonomy to indigenous communities. And in practice, this gives indigenous rulers free room to implement authoritarian governments where basic human rights, including those of religious minorities or converts out of traditional indigenous beliefs, are not respected. I think this is something that must be denounced, and it's a constitutional provision that's I think really dangerous. I'm convinced that respect for indigenous traditions and culture is very important in any democratic society, especially in those countries where there is a strong and historical presence of indigenous groups. But it must not be used as an excuse to tolerate and endorse bad governance and gross human rights violations, such as, and those are the cases we're talking about, as torture or exclusion from basic social services. This is also happening in Mexico, but the legislation is all right, except that it's not always being enforced. But in Colombia, the legislation actually does not, I mean, the Constitution does not give the central state the authority to actually enter indigenous territories when faced with human rights violations like this.
Mr. Cole, real quickly.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to offer some thoughts on Haiti and Dominican Republic, which are countries that are of great importance to us. Haiti, a great example, again, of root causes, tremendous poverty, as we know, breakdown in the rule of law, breakdown in the administration of justice, tremendous need to monitor aid carefully so that it ends up in appropriate projects that will build up civil society there and thereby, among other things, vindicate religious freedom. Dominican Republic, as you know, there's been a very difficult situation there over the last couple of years, given a Supreme Court decision that the High Court of the Dominican Republic issued, which threatened the viability of certain residents of the Dominican Republic, many of whom are of Haitian origin, to continue to stay there. The government has been, I think, attempting to rectify that situation by passing new legal provisions that would provide a course for validating residency on an ongoing basis. As Ms. Stengel very eloquently pointed out in a different context, the laws may be fine, but we need to make sure that they are administered effectively and that appropriate resources are devoted so that all petitioners have the opportunity to vindicate their rights. So I would just respectfully request, and I'm sure it'll come up in your conversations with the Haitian Prime Minister as well, given the fact that many of these affected residents are originally of Haitian origin, that enough resources be allocated in order to make sure that the legal remedies which the government is now passing to protect these residents actually work on the ground to permit these residents to make claims to continue to stay in the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'll make an observation. I have a question. To me, when Pope Paul visited Cuba, I thought some changes would follow. Now you have another Pope visiting Cuba next week. I just think that they somehow legitimize the governments when you have such a high ranking, or the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church going to these islands where there's so much oppression of religion. And I don't know how they don't see that. So I'm hoping that this visit would make a change. But I'm not very hopeful, because they have had roundups. People have been thrown in jail. The most active ones are going to be kept away. So, you know, to me, this visit is more about legitimizing this whole thing that's been going on with Cuba in the last 3 months, over the last year, than anything else. And the church doesn't seem to, you know, to see that, because I didn't see any changes when Pope Paul went to Cuba. And the question that I have is, we're talking about, obviously, all different types of religion. And we also have the Jewish community in South and Central America. And how would you characterize the anti-Semitism trends in Latin America in recent years? Because I know that Buenos Aires has about 200 Jews. Sao Paulo has about 80,000 to 100,000. And some of the other areas. Ms. Stengel, would you?
Unfortunately, I think there have been significant increases in anti-Semitism, particularly seen in Venezuela, but also in countries like Argentina. A lot of it is rhetoric, sometimes things like graffiti, things, not actual physical attacks, but creating an environment of hostility. And many of the governments of those countries, in the case of Venezuela, has actually stoked that and encouraged that in some ways, whereas other governments have stood back and done nothing, which allows this environment to continue to grow. I would say it's something definitely to continue to watch. The Jewish population has played a very important role historically in many of these countries, and will continue to do so, I believe. But I think it's looking at the general climate of the world, looking at what's happening in Europe specifically, I would hate to see that kind of thing be exported and grow and increase in Latin America as well.
We can affirm that as democracy has weakened in many areas of Latin America, there's a definite rise in anti-Semitism. Venezuela being one, Argentina continued, Ecuador. We can go country by country. We at Cornell and HCLC started a coalition, Hispanic Jewish Coalition. Got organized just a couple of months ago. We were meeting with members of the Israeli government, Jewish community here, and leaders in Latin America. One of the ways that can be strengthened is that every nation has, just like you have a committee on foreign affairs here, they have a committee that deals with the state of Israel. In some of these places, there's people of conviction that want to do everything they can to make sure that they deal with issues of anti-Semitism, that they don't just let acts of anti-Semitism in conversation in art, drawing, many of which are rising forth. So we believe that one of the contributions that the Christian community can make is to both, you use the word denounce, but also announce, do some positive contributions that can strengthen our relationship with the Jewish community. When you don't know a community, it's easy to be opposed, but we believe very strongly that these steps need to be taken, and which is why we've created this coalition.
Yes, you're very right to raise the issue of anti-Semitism. I think apart from the cases of Venezuela and Argentina, which are really, well, mostly Venezuela, but also Argentina, the most serious cases or examples of growing anti-Semitism. Other countries of Latin America have also seen isolated incidents, and it's something that should be followed and monitored very closely.
Thank you. I'd like to address the issue of anti-Semitism because it's a very important one, but I'd like to just start out with a few comments on Cuba because I think that the two issues are in a way related. First of all, I want to express my deep respect and compassion with the views that you've articulated. I myself come from a family that originated in Spain, and I know what it is like to suffer the divisions that come from a civil war or other political upheaval, and the terrible pain that comes from having families be divided over political issues. And I have deep respect for my friends in the Cuban American community who, like you, Mr. Ranking Member, believe the way you do out of tremendous good faith and a desire to see what is best for the Cuban people. Just by means of explanation, as I'm sure you already know, I take comfort from knowing that it's not just the testimony of three popes now, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Pope Francis, but the Catholic Church in Cuba itself, which I had the privilege of visiting a couple of years ago at the time of Pope Benedict's visit, that is very strongly supportive of this new opening and this rapprochement as a way of preserving the rights of the Cuban people and hopefully opening the doors for greater development. That is a hope, but it's a hope that frankly is based on our gospel values, and we as a church embrace this objective not just because we think it's right, but because we think we are committed to do so by the words of our Savior Jesus, who told us to love our enemies and to engage in dialogue and to forgive those who have harmed us. So I offer that in deep respect and with awareness that your sense of the issues come from a great commitment to the good of the Cuban people, just by means of explanation of how we have come up with a different tactical approach. We share your aversion to the way in which the Cuban government operates, and we hope and pray that this opening will vindicate the rights of the Cuban people in the future. How is this related to anti-Semitism? It seems to me that part of the problem that exists, as Mr. Petri and others have pointed out, and Mr. Luna, is that communities in Latin America and elsewhere have been ghettoized, have been separated from one another. They have not experienced the truth of their respective religions. Dialogue is a great avenue towards overcoming those separations. We see the blessed relationship that exists between Pope Francis and a number of leaders of the Argentine Jewish community, and how that dialogue, that relationship, that friendship has hopefully started the path towards a mitigation of anti-Semitism in Argentina. And we see that dialogue, that communication, with hope towards opening up other areas of dialogue so that anti-Semitism and all other forms of hatred and division will be eliminated. Thank you.
I'll just finish by saying that the way Venezuela is going is just a satellite of Cuba.
Yes.
This is exactly what they did after they took control in 1959. They went after the church to destroy the church, and they were very successful, or any other religion. And I think you're seeing the 33,000 praxis that are in Venezuela from Cuba going about it the same way. Venezuela was a religious, people would, go to church, and now they were afraid to go to church. They were afraid to express their religion.
Yes.
Because of the government. So what we're seeing is the Cubanization of Venezuela.
I definitely share your concern, Mr. Ranking Member. I was in Venezuela 3 years ago, meeting with the local church there, and very much support the view that concern you have about trying to support their work so that they don't end up with the same tragic consequences as in Cuba.
Can I just add something else? I'm sorry. You know, this is fascinating to me because I saw the church in Poland,
Yes.
how active it was
Yes. Yes.
in basically moving that country forward.
Yes.
We don't see that movement in Latin America. We don't see that movement in Central America.
Yes, that's a great point, Mr. Ranking Member, and you know, I think that there are a lot of historical reasons for that. There's a different, frankly, in Cuba, there was a different relationship between the Cuban Catholic Church and the local colonial powers, and then subsequently the local Cuban government that took over once the Spanish left. I think your point is very well taken, that institutionally, the Polish Catholic Church, for its own historical reasons and the experiences of World War II, etc., was in a much more effective position to be able to take up the challenges of supporting the political process than is the case and was recently the case in Cuba. As a result, I think the Cuban Catholic Church has felt that its efforts to vindicate human rights and to move the path of development towards the establishment of an authentic civil society has to be effectuated through other means different from the path of the church in Poland. And frankly, I think that's one of the endorsements that Pope John Paul II himself gave to the church in Cuba for that choice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Absolutely. Thanks for the insight. I'm sitting here thinking about communism in general, what we saw with Mao and Stalin, and do away with the church, do away with that right to peacefully assemble and gather and talk and worship somebody other than the government entity, the state as it was known. I think in Cuba, I think Castro was probably more Catholic than maybe Stalin or Mao were any religion. That's why I think the Catholic Church maybe hung around a little longer. That's just my perception, but I think you're exactly right. In Venezuela, the elimination of religion in general helped solidify the state as the religion, and I think we see that over and over in a common pattern within socialism. So I want to thank the witnesses. This has been fascinating. Go back to the anti-Semitic activities. I will say this about Uruguay. I think the way they've handled the terrorist bombing against the Jewish Cultural Center or the embassy there recently is probably indicative of they're not as anti-Semitic as maybe other countries. I applaud them for that. That's the reason I wanted to bring that out in their efforts to find out, about that bombing. So we'll conclude, and pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 business days to allow any statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitation in the rules. Also, if we have any additional questions, we'll submit those to you and ask you to respond back. That will be made part of the record. So without any other business, we'll stand adjourned.